Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. and I am starting up a new YouTube channel, as you may have noticed. This one is called Reformed GGA. My typical channel is Relationship and Truth, and that channel is more of a theological channel, and I don't usually talk about guns and stuff like that over there all that much, but guns is obviously a topic that is indeed near and dear to my heart. As a Reformed American Christian, it's a major part of our history and heritage is being proponents of the Second Amendment. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk about that, and I wanted to have a special place to do that where I could just kind of geek out on this stuff. I still want the Relationship and Truth channel to be primarily theological, and I don't want to throw too many things that aren't necessarily theological into it. I mean, technically everything's theological to one extent or another, but that one's more of an apologetics channel where I'm talking about the Christian faith and what it means to be a Christian, as well as defending the Christian faith from naysayers, so on and so forth. This channel isn't really like that. This is a channel where I get to geek out a little bit more. And in particular, today I'm going to be talking about the some factors that contribute to handgun effectiveness, which I'm really excited to talk about. But nonetheless, since I am a Christian, I am still, even in talking about guns and those kinds of things, I am still bound by Scripture, and I am still a Christian first and foremost, and because of that, that's going to shape everything that I do from there on out. And so before I get into talking about some of the factors that contribute to handgun effectiveness, I wanted to go ahead and read through a passage of Scripture with you guys. This passage of Scripture comes from 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 19 through 22. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 19 through 22. This is a period in Israel's history, and Israel is basically the name for the particular ethnic people of God in the Old Testament, and it's a period of their history where they have been overcome by a group known as the Philistines. And the Philistines are basically now ruling Israel lands, telling them what they can and cannot do, and the Israelites are rising up against the Philistines. They've invaded their land that was given to them by God, and they're going to take care of it. And in verse 19 it says, "No blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." So the Philistines came to power, and they said, hey, we don't want these people rising up against us, so we're going to take out their means of producing weapons. Verse 20, "So all the Israelites went to the Philistines to sharpen their plows, mattocks, axes, and sickles. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for plows and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for pitchforks and axes, and for putting a point on a cattle prod." Verse 22, "So on the day of battle, not a sword or spear could be found in the hand of any of the troops who were with Saul and Jonathan." And by the way, Saul and Jonathan were the people who were leading the Israelites to fight against the Philistines. "Only Saul and his son Jonathan had weapons." It's an interesting passage. When you look at it, this passage, and of course there's lots of other passages that would need to be examined, but this particular passage, if we were to ask ourselves what the position of the Bible is regarding weapons, and especially the control, the rights of governing bodies to enact weapon control measures, if we were to take a look at that relative to this particular passage, I think that any fair reading would say that this passage does not present these things in a positive light. It does not present weapons control in a positive light. And it seems to advocate, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, the idea of not complying with such rules. Yes, the fact that there were no blacksmiths in the land by the formal decree of the Philistines did definitely limit what the Hebrews could do, but it didn't completely stop them from producing weapons, because even though the troops didn't have weapons, Saul and Jonathan somehow wound up with them. somewhere along the line, someone did not comply with the intent of this measure. The obvious intent was to keep the Israelites, the Hebrews, from having weapons. And here are the leaders of the Israelites with weapons. Somewhere along the line, someone did not comply. And you look at the passage as a whole, and the Bible as a whole, the Bible does seem to be in favor of what Saul and Jonathan and the Israelites in general have done here. I don't think there would be a fair reading of this particular passage, especially, that would say that what the Philistines did in trying to limit what the Hebrews would have access to in terms of weapons was good or right or just. And this was one of the great complaints you look through the Bible regarding the Philistines. First of all, the Philistines were in land that had been promised by God to the Israelites, so of course that's going to be a problem. But on top of that, the Philistines, as far as their morality is concerned, are described in the Bible as being unjust, as being wicked. They were not righteous according to the standards of God's law. And so, when it comes to Israelite conflict with them, there's the issue of the land being promised by God. That's one issue. But there's also the moral issue. And the moral issue actually permeates the other one. That is earlier, all the way back at the beginning, in the first 5 books in the Torah, or another name for it is the Pentateuch, when God was telling Abraham why his descendants were going to inherit this land, he says that they're going to inherit it and drive the peoples there out, basically because these were wicked people. Having Israel come in and drive these people out was a judgment upon those people for their wickedness. And it wasn't necessarily a religious thing. God's people throughout history have, in general, there are specific exceptions for people who have called themselves Christians and so forth that have not done this. But as far as the main key sources of the faith itself, namely the Bible, does not advocate going out and forcing people to convert at the point of the sword, unlike other religions that actually have done that in the past and at their earliest points were like that. Islam comes to mind. Early Islam was indeed very militant, and they did believe in forced conversions at the point of a sword, whereas biblical religion, on the other hand, generally not like that. When God's people would fight against other people, it was not so as to force them to convert to believing in the one true God of the Bible. Instead, it was because these other people were wicked, because these other people were unjust, because these other people were outright tyrannical, and they needed to be stopped. This is also one of the main things that influenced the American Revolution, is people reading the Bible, understanding these kinds of differences. And when the American Revolution was started, it was actually instigated to a great extent by religious people in America. There were a number of religious people in America who advocated the Revolutionary War, and they did so on biblical grounds. They were saying that the government that is over us, England at the time, is a government that has become tyrannical. It is a government that has become wicked. It is a government that is not just. And for all these reasons, we need to free ourselves of this. We need to do away with it. And that's what they accomplished. It wasn't a war to convert the English to American Protestantism, but it was a war to say what you're doing is wrong. And yes, it is wrong on the standard of God's law. That's still a factor in it. We're still judging things on the basis of the only one who has the authority to say what is right and wrong, and that is God. But it's not to convert the English. It was so that we could secure our own freedom from tyranny, so that we could secure a system in which there would be justice and in which there would be righteousness, so on and so forth. And that is something that is taken across. Now, this doesn't mean that Christians are good with just killing anyone and everyone. There's many biblical mandates that regard what is just and what isn't just, and what can be done and what cannot be done. And like I said, for one, we don't fight people to convert them. Early Islam did that, and there's other religions that are definitely like that to one extent or another. And sadly, yes, there have been people who have called themselves Christians who have done that, but not at the behest of the Bible. They're doing it contrary to the example of the Bible. The Bible does not put that forward as an example to be followed. What the Bible tells us is that we don't fight for those we don't fight people bodily over those kinds of things. But there are reasons to bodily fight, and overcoming tyranny is one of those. In a more recent example, you might think of World War II, in which you have the tyranny of the Axis powers sweeping over the earth. And it was horrible. It was brutal. It was terrible, and it needed to be stopped. And the people of God historically are the ones who look at the spread of evil in the world and say, no, this far, no further. We have to stop this. That's the kind of people that the people of God who actually read the Bible and are in the Bible and stay with the Bible are. They care about justice and righteousness in the world. And yes, they care about converting people as well. There's no doubt about that. But they usually separate the two. And even though we might not necessarily, get everyone converted to our religion, we're still going to fight tyranny and wickedness and oppression in the various places that we find it through the various means that are available to us, even if those people that we fight for never wind up becoming Christians. If they are being truly oppressed, if the people who are over them right now are truly wicked, we will be their advocates. And that is a historical American value, and it's ultimately a biblical value. But it has become very endemic of America, and that America does tend to get involved in other people's conflicts. And historically, how much this is true now, of course, is greatly debatable. But historically, the issue, especially from a Christian point of view, was the idea of seeking justice in the earth. Even if the other people aren't going to be Christians along with us, we are still going to seek justice for them. It's still on the basis of God's standards of justice, of course, but the rights and privileges of Christian justice do not extend only to Christians. Anyways, that turned into a little bit of a sermon. I just meant to read it. But food for thought, if nothing else. Let's get into the main topic of this video that I wanted to get into. Take a quick look at our time here. I wanted to talk about factors that contribute to handgun effectiveness. And yeah, I'm getting into the whole caliber debate and those kinds of things. And when a lot of people talk about how effective a handgun is going to be, one of the things that ironically actually still comes up, and there's been lots of studies that have been done on this to say that we probably shouldn't be so obsessed with it, but one of the things that still comes up is the size of the cartridge itself, the kinetic energy in the cartridge. So when I do this analysis, I'm going to look at the kinetic energy of the various cartridges under examination. But there's other issues as well that I would argue need to be looked at, and I don't have time to look at every particular aspect, but some basic general ones that are also going to come up is how many rounds are going to be used in a specific encounter. If you are forced to defend your life, does the number of rounds that you use have any bearing on how effective your gun winds up being? And then, of course, the accuracy of the gun is also going to be a major issue. How accurate are you with that particular gun? And so those are the three things that I want to look at for things that can contribute to handgun effectiveness. One is basically the cartridge itself, especially in terms of its power, its kinetic energy. Then we're also going to look at how many rounds are being used in a particular encounter, and then also the accuracy that are being used in various encounters. And for the basic data, I'm actually pulling from Greg Ellerfrit's study. That's what I have pulled up here. And if you want to look this up, it is on buckeyefirearms.org/alternate-look-handgun-stopping-power-power. And this is a study that has been out for a good long time now that Greg Ellerfrit's done, in which he looked at nearly 2,000 cases of various guns being used, and basically just saw what the stats showed happened. And the ones that we're going to be particularly interested in is, of course, the type of round itself and the kinetic energy associated with that. And frankly, that varies quite a bit. It is possible to have a particular cartridge that, when it's loaded one way, might be only 300 or so foot-pounds of energy. If you load it a different way, you might get a little over 500 foot-pounds of energy. It can vary quite a bit. So what I'm going to do with these ones is I'm basically going to keep things comparable. I'm going to basically go with Remington plinking ammo, basically the Remington generic stuff, and go with the kinetic energy readings they get from a lot of the ballistic charts that you can get online off of that. The only exception to that is .22 ammo. I didn't decide to go with Remington there. I went with CCI just because I'm more familiar with it, but it's not like it vastly differs from Remington. It's just a little different, but kept within the same company and the same general type of ammunition to keep things relatively comparable. But from Greg Ellerfrit's study, and like I said, you can get the kinetic energy information from a host of places online that have ballistics charts and whatnot. But the information that I'm pulling from Greg Ellerfrit's study is some of the other data that I'm looking for. For example, the number of rounds that are used, the average number of rounds that are used to achieve incapacitation, that is, stopping the threat. And so in his study, he posted that. For example, on the 25 ACP, that number is 2.2. An average of 2.2 shots to stop the threat. At least, and he does that with other cartridges as well. He also includes centerfire rifles and shotguns in his study as well. I'm not going to be looking at that. I'm just going to be looking at the handgun information that he provides. So want to know the number of rounds that are used, and then I'm also interested in the accuracy. How much does accuracy contribute to the effectiveness of a handgun? And he does measure accuracy, not quite as well as I would like. He defines accuracy as being able to hit the head or torso, which are generally the targets you want to hit in general, but handguns are not overly effective in general. At least most handguns are, in that it's not like you shoot someone anywhere on the body and they just automatically fall over. Generally, for a handgun to incapacitate someone, it has to hit them in a vital spot. You're basically talking about the heart, the brain specifically, or some other part of the upper central nervous system is where you have to hit someone to incapacitate them in one shot. And so a hit to the head or torso in general might not be all that effective. And so defining that as being accurate shot placement is a little bit troublesome, because with handguns, that's not as accurate as you need to be. You need to be more accurate than that, but at least it gives us a baseline. And then the big thing is, how do you define handgun effectiveness? That's a real big issue. Greg Ellerfrit's was really interested in stopping power, the ability to have a one-shot stop. The problem, though, is that in real-world scenarios, which is where he gets his data from real-world scenarios, it's very often the case that people will wind up firing multiple times, even if they technically don't need to. That is, the idea in self-defense is that you shoot until the threat goes away, and that might mean that the assailant takes off running, and if he does, good riddance to him. Or he might keep coming at you, and you just keep firing until he's not coming at you anymore. And in those cases, it might be true that the first round that you fired could have, punctured a major artery or something, and in time that would have led to a bleed out, but that injury by itself wasn't enough to stop him in the moment, and so you might wind up firing more rounds until he does actually stop. Even though the first round could have been lethal, it might not have taken effect. And a lot of people, when they're faced with this kind of a situation, a defensive situation, whatnot, the tendency is going to be usually to fire, more often than once. At least with a lot of handguns, that's going to be the case. To fire more than one round in a given incident. And so getting data for one-shot stops is actually really difficult, because it's not all that common that someone fires just one shot. It's because they know that handguns in general are a little underpowered and they want to stop the threat, and so when they start firing, they're generally going to keep firing at least for 2 shots, if not 3 or 4 or 5, enough to make sure that the threat has been neutralized. Either the threat has run away or the threat is somehow incapacitated. And so one-shot stops is an interesting statistic to look at for handgun effectiveness, but from real-world data, it's hard to get reliable numbers just because that's not how real-world situations work out. People don't shoot at a bad guy and then sit there and wait and say, was that good enough for you? A lot of times there's gonna be follow-up shots because they don't want to risk it, and I completely understand. If someone continues to present any kind of a threat against your life or against the life of someone else, yeah, taking the extra shot, not always a bad idea. So one-shot stops, just from real-world data, is really hard to come by. So the way that I'm going to define handgun effectiveness is just the overarching, did it stop the threat or not? So I'm going to take Greg Elfritz's percentage of people who are not incapacitated and then do basically the complement of that. So in 25 ACP, the percentage of people who are not incapacitated was 35%, which means that 65% of people who encountered someone with a 25 ACP were in fact incapacitated. Okay. It was effective 65% of the time. It was ineffective 35% of the time. So that's what I'm going to describe as being our measure of handgun effectiveness. Did it stop the bad guy or did it not? I don't care about how many rounds it took in and of itself. All I cared about is whether or not it happened and at what rate it happened. How often does the handgun succeed in stopping the threat? How often does it work in stopping the other guy? So that's where I'm getting that data from. And like I said, for the ballistics information, you can pull that out of a number of ballistics charts that are available online. I think one of them that I referenced was like Ballistics 101 or something like that. I can't remember at the moment, but lots of places that do that. So taking Greg Elfritz's numbers and Muzzle Energy numbers, this is what I came up with. So Greg Elfritz's numbers included caliber 22, and I disagree with the way that he did his study, and just that it messes up the data a little bit. But for 22, he included 22 short, 22 long, and 22 long rifle. And then in the numbers that he puts forward, he doesn't differentiate whether it's a handgun or a rifle that's being used, which is just all kinds of annoying. So the 22 category actually includes a lot of data, lots of individual data sets that probably should have been separated out, but he put them all together. And for the 22, the muzzle energy that I found for CCI ammunition fired out of a typical handgun length, because that's what we're talking about here, is handguns. The typical muzzle energy was 61 foot-pounds, and then the number of rounds, average number of rounds per encounter, I should be more specific, was 1.38. The average accuracy, that is the number of rounds, the proportion of rounds that hit the head or torso compared to the number of rounds in general that were fired. As a decimal would be 0.76, which as a percentage would of course be 76%. And then the overall incapacitation rate, which is what we're really interested in, was 0.69. Now you go through all of these, and that's basically how I got all of the numbers for all of these. You know, look at a ballistics chart, you get the kinetic energy on one side. Go to Greg Ellerfritz's study, total number of rounds fired in all of the cases, how many people were actually involved in those cases. Divide it out, you get the number of rounds per encounter, the average number of rounds per encounter. No, you cannot actually fire 2.2 rounds. That doesn't work. But you can get an average and estimate it out, and then look at the accuracy, how many of those rounds actually hit the head or torso, and then the incapacitation rate, which is just the complements of the failure to incapacitation rate. The complements of the failure to incapacitate. And this is what we're actually trying to figure out. This is what we're trying to get to. What is it that determines this? What determines how successful a handgun is or not? And we're going to be looking at these three factors right here. Muzzle energy, the rounds per encounter, and then the accuracy. Which of these contribute the most to achieving this incapacitation rate? All right, and you'll see that the numbers vary quite a bit here. In terms of muzzle energy, I mean, you have 22s fired out of a handgun, which is, 61 foot-pounds of energy. It's pretty small. 25's not a whole lot better. 32 is getting up there a little bit, 129. And by the way, the colors have to do with the type of data that is involved. Blue means that this data comes from a combination of different data groups. So 22 is 22 short, 22 long rifle, and it also includes 22s fired out of handguns and rifles. And so it's a mixed data set, which in statistical studies you're really not supposed to do because it produces all kinds of problems, but sometimes people wind up putting the data together just because individually you don't wind up with a big enough data set to actually do good statistics on, so they just combined it all. And that's basically what Greg Ellerfritz did. The ones that are in red are ones where the data set was smaller than you would expect to have in a study. For 32 ACP and 44 Magnum, there were less than 30 cases that were studied in each one, which is a relatively small data set when you're talking about, nearly 2,000 cases altogether. A set of 30, another set of 30, technically these are less than 30. Not really great, not super reliable, but it's there. So yeah, Greg Ellerfritz went over all of these: 22, 25, 32, 380, 38 special, 9mm, 45, 40, 357, and he combined 357 Magnum and 357 SIG. Just because of how he collected his data. Some of his data he collected from newspaper articles and things like that. And sometimes in a news article, it will only say that the person used a 357. It won't say whether they used a 357 Magnum or a 357 SIG. And so you kind of wind up having to combine them just because the sources are not descriptive enough. And then 44 Magnum is also on the list, but that data set wasn't particularly large. Like I said, less than 30 overall encounters, so a little bit cautious about that one. But this is how the data came out when it comes to muzzle energy. Pretty great range. 61 foot-pounds of energy for the weakest caliber that we have here. 22 fired out of a handgun versus 44 Magnum. And this is kind of on the low end of 44 Magnum, but we could safely say probably at least 931 foot-pounds of energy. 357s can usually achieve more than 500, especially with a good loading. But like I said, I went through kind of generic plinker ammo for all of these, and so if the numbers seem a little low to you, that's why. But yeah, so all that data is in. And the number of rounds per encounter was actually pretty different. For 22, the number of rounds per encounter was actually pretty low, 1.38. Whereas but with 25 it was considerably higher. 32 was low kind of again. 380 and 38 special, kind of in between. And then when you get into the more common defensive automatic, semi-automatics, like 9mm, 45, 40, all of those ones have at least 2 rounds per encounter. And that makes sense with semi-autos. Semi-autos are typically a little bit easier to get follow-up shots. They typically have larger magazines, and so the people using them are not as worried about running out of rounds, and so they're more likely to fire them. You'll notice one that is noticeably smaller than the others in this category, and that is the 45. The 45, because it's such a large round, does not typically have as big of a magazine as others, and so people who fire 45s are a little bit more ammo conscious than other people are. But still, usually more than 2 rounds per encounter. 357 mag, it goes down a little bit again, and 357 mag is usually revolver. They don't hold as many rounds, so people are going to be really ammo conscious when using those. 357 SIG, though, that's a semi-auto, and, well, that's one of the problems of having a mixed data set. And then 44 Magnum, the number of rounds per encounter is again a little bit on the smaller side, and 44 Magnum is usually a revolver, and so it makes sense that the number of rounds per encounter would be a little bit slower, just because people are not going to be as willing to fire multiple rounds because they don't want to run out. And then when it comes to accuracy, it's kind of a mixed bag. For the 22, the accuracy isn't terrible, 76% hitting the head or torso. 25 ACP is absolutely awful, as it turned out in the study of real-world examples of people actually being able to hit the intended target in the head or torso. Only 62% of the time, not great. 32 was pretty decent, 78%. 380, 38 special, 9mm, and 40, all kind of middle of the road, 70s. 45 was actually quite a bit higher. And again, that might be just a simple fact that people with 45s know that their magazines are relatively limited, and so they're a little bit more judicious with their shots and shot placements. But statistically, they actually did pretty good. 85% hit the target in the head or torso. That's not terrible. The 357 Magnum also did pretty good. 81% of the shots hitting the head or torso. Not bad. 44 Magnum did real good. 88% hitting the head or torso. So with the larger revolvers, the 357 and the 44 Magnum, and with the low capacity semi-auto 45, you tend to see increased accuracy for whatever reason. I personally think it's just because the number of rounds that they carry is small. Revolvers usually only have 5 or 6 shots. A 45 Colt, for example, will usually only have a 7 or 8 shot magazine, and so it just doesn't hold as much, and so you would probably tend to be a little bit more judicious with your marksmanship. And then in terms of what I'm calling for this study, the success rate, how many times did it actually incapacitate the threat? You see pretty quickly that there's definitely a pretty drastic difference between the smaller calibers, which are all in the 60s for their incapacitation rate, compared with everything that's 380 and above. 380 and above, your incapacitation rate is going to be in the 80s, and in the case of 357, low 90s. So there is definitely a break between the two groups. Small caliber, larger calibers, 380 and up, tends to have a pretty marked difference in what the overall incapacitation rate is. But my question is, what is it that's contributing most to this incapacitation rate? We see that the smaller calibers have a lower incapacitation rate, meaning they're not as successful at putting down the threat. But is that because of this issue right here, the muzzle energy issue, or is it because of other issues? like the number of rounds per encounter that are involved, or the general accuracy that's involved, or combinations thereof. And so that's what I want to look at. And to do that, first thing that we need to do is we need to standardize all of this data. And standardizing the raw data, just taking it as it is pretty easy. You take the highest value in each one of these categories and you divide all of the data by that. So in the case of muzzle energy, the highest muzzle energy is the 44 Magnum. 931 is the value we're using. Like I said, this is just general plinking ammo that we're using, but we're trying to do that consistently throughout all of it. So 931 is the largest value. We're going to compare everything to that. So everything now gets converted to a proportion of that total. So the Magnum, of course, has a perfect value of 1, 931. Out of 931, that ratio is 1. Whereas the 357 at 535 foot-pounds of energy is only about half of that, a little over half of that, and proportioning all the way on through. And then for rounds per encounter, the highest is the 9mm with 2.45 rounds used per encounter. So we're going to compare everything to that. And of course, the 9mm gets the perfect 1. Everything else is going to be some proportion thereof. And then in the case of accuracy, when you're comparing the whole data sets, the most accurate is the 44 Magnum with 88% of shots going to the head or torso. Everything gets compared to that. The 44 Magnum is the trendsetter there. Everything else is a proportion thereof. And now that the data has been standardized, now we can see what is the greatest contributor to the incapacitation rate. And by the way, the incapacitation rate itself also needs to be standardized. What is the greatest incapacitation rate? That's with the 357 Magnum, 0.91. Let's standardize everything according to that. So the 357 is the one that sets the standard there. That's the actual standard. That's what I'm saying actual here, but it's the actual standardized incapacitation rate. The best one is the 357. Everything is a proportion of the 357 in that regard. And then over here is a predicted value. And that predicted value is derived from combining these three numbers right here. Now, since all of this has already been standardized, if this number here was basically just a direct combination of all three of these, you would have a third of this plus a third of this plus a third of this, all combining and adding up to the final standardized incapacitation rate. Okay. But what I've done is I've allowed the proportion to fluctuate. Like I said, if everything contributed equally to the incapacitation rate, it would be a third of this, a third of this, and a third of this. There's three things, so it would be a third, and a third. Basically, 33 and a third percent, 33 and a third percent, 33 and a third percent. But I have allowed the coefficients to vary so that I can actually see what combination actually best accounts for it. And that's what these green numbers are for. They are the coefficients that are actually used to achieve this combination. So let's see if I can bring it up here. So the formula that's in here takes the coefficient, multiplies it by the value for that specific caliber. Coefficient times the standardized value as far as, say, rounds per encounter. And then coefficient times the standardized value for the accuracy, so on and so forth. Okay, that's what this is here, and I made it so that I can go ahead and go in and edit it and try different combinations, and making sure that the entire sum of these coefficients would all add up to one whole. So out of a whole, what does it take to get to this? And then this number over here is the difference between the predicted value that's made by combining all of these and the actual incapacitation rate, standardized incapacitation rate that was actually observed. And then down here is the median error. So what I'm trying to do basically is adjust these numbers right here so that my median error is as small as possible. And I went with median because the average is usually too much so affected by outliers, especially when you're dealing with a relatively small set of data points like this. The average is very easily skewed by very large numbers or very small numbers. The median, though, always sits in the middle of the data set, and so it's not as easily skewed. And that's what I am going to minimize. Now, just to show you how this works, I'll go ahead and basically reset one of these to 0 and show you what happens. All right, so this is the overall data. This has been standardized, and now I'm trying to create predictions to match the actual standardized incapacitation rate that we observe. And so I'm going to start out by saying that basically everything is more or less equally contributing to the predicted scores over here. So basically a third, and a third. Now, technically a third would be 33 and a third, but I'm just doing to 2 sig figs. So when you do that, the extra value kind of has to go in different places. And so that's why they're not exactly the same. If I could adjust it, but I'm only doing 2 significant figures. And right now you can see that the median error between the actual values and the predicted values right now is pretty big. I mean, 1 to 0.73, 0.95 to 0.737. The errors are pretty large, and so the median error is 0.21503. That's a pretty large margin of error. And so I'm going to go through and I'm just going to start adjusting from the left onto the right and seeing what eventually gets this as small as I can make it. So right now I'm starting with basically a third of it being there, everything contributing equally. Well, maybe I should weight the muzzle energy more. So I'll go ahead and I'll adjust this one upwards, and then you'll see that the other two here, they automatically went down when I adjusted this one up, so that still all adds up to 1. Saying, okay, if I increase what's going on here, what does that do to my average error? Does that help my overall proportion, or does it hurt it? And as you can see, it hurts it. My error boundary has now grown. So taking it up to 4 was a bad direction. Let's see if I decrease it down to 0.2, what happens. So basically in terms of what is contributing here, 20 right now it's standing at 20% muzzle energy, 40% rounds per encounter, and 40% accuracy. What is that going to create predicted values that'll actually get me where I need to go? And that error margin right there, 0.14, that's still pretty large. Let's see if we can get it smaller. We'll keep going down in terms of the muzzle energy, and sure enough, the error margin gets smaller, which means that these numbers, the predicted values, are getting closer to the actual numbers, so I'm going in the right direction here. Let's see here, 0.05. Yeah, that's still smaller than the last one I got, 0.07 now instead of 0.09. Let's just take it all the way down to 0. What does that do? Well, that goes in the wrong direction. So I need to go back up here. 0.05, let's see what that number was, 7231. Maybe if I go up just a little bit from there, it'll get better. So 0.7231, 0.7803, that's going in the wrong direction, so maybe a little bit smaller. So 0.05, yeah, that median error boundary is better. Let's go down a little bit more, 0.04. That is still better. If I take it down just a little bit more, will it get better? 7008, nope, 70, so that's not going to work. So for muzzle energy, the margin of error is optimized when it makes up only 4% of the predicted value. All right, and then after I've optimized the muzzle energy coefficient, then I can go on to rounds per encounter. Let's try what I did before. I'll start by first raising it. So 0.5, what does that do? Well, before it was 0.48. That was 0.7008, and then I raised it to 0.5, and that made it go up a little bit, so that's not the right direction. So let's go down. I'll just say 0.45. No, that also went the wrong direction, so it's going to be in between somewhere. Let's say 0.47. 69, that's a little bit better. 0.46. So 6974 compared to 0.47, which was 91. 6991. So 46 is just a little bit better than that. But if I go all the way down to 0.45, it's a 7144. So yeah, as far as two sig figs are concerned, it optimizes at 4.6. And then this one is determined by the sum of the other ones. It all has to add up to 1. So that one's done too. And then usually once I'm done fiddling around with this one, I'll come back to the other one just to see if some changes will help. Nope. So 0.04 still seems to be best. Let's go down to 0.03. Nope. So 0.04 is the advantage there. Okay. And that is how you go through and you optimize it. And when you do that, and you're just looking at the raw data from the Elfrit study as a whole, including the mixed data sets, including the data sets that were really small, what you get is that the incapacitation rate is predicted by all three of these factors, but not proportionally. Muzzle energy was a contributing factor, but a very small contributing factor, just 4% of the total. Rounds count was a much more significant contributing factor to the incapacitation rate at 0.46 or 46%. And then the one that had the biggest proportion that contributed the most was the accuracy that the shooters were able to achieve. The more often that you could hit the head or torso with the gun, the more likely the person was to be incapacitated, which, if you think about it, makes sense. But what's interesting here is that the incapacitation rate actually doesn't have a whole lot to do with the muzzle energy. It is a contributing factor, but very small. When we looked at the incapacitation rates before, and we looked at the small calibers, we said, well, these ones are noticeably different from the other ones, so maybe it's the muzzle energy. You know, these ones have lower muzzle energy, the top three lower muzzle energy, and then higher muzzle energy. Maybe that's the issue. Well, when we take a look at the muzzle energy combined with the rounds used per encounter and the accuracy in each encounter, it turns out that the lower muzzle energies actually wasn't the biggest issue. The biggest issues were actually the combinations of the number of rounds used per encounter and the accuracy per encounter. That is, when it comes to those small calibers, there are some combination of inaccurate or don't have a high enough rounds count to get you to a good incapacitation rate. It's not because, at least it's not so much because the caliber is too small, it's because there are not enough rounds on target or enough rounds on target with sufficient accuracy to make a difference. So, I mean, take the 22 and the 32, for example. 1.38 rounds per encounter and 1.52 rounds per encounter. Those are lower values than everything else that's on the table. The accuracy for them is on par with some of the others that do pretty good. 0.78, 0.76, that's comparable with the 380 down to the 9mm at least, and even comparable with the 40. So those aren't bad accuracies, but they are bad numbers of rounds going downrange. More rounds downrange would, at least by this data, be more effective. And then the 25 ACP, it does have quite a few rounds going downrange. It's in the range of the 9mm through the 40. But the accuracy with which those rounds went downrange was absolutely terrible. And that's why these smaller calibers wound up being ineffective by comparison. It had very little to do with the muzzle energy itself as to the actual shooting characteristics of the gun. Some combination of not enough rounds and poor accuracy is what wound up creating a poor incapacitation rate by this data. Okay. And in terms of the raw data itself, accuracy is the first concern, followed closely by rounds count, and last of all, not that it's not a contributor, it is, but it's a very small contributor, then finally muzzle energy. That I find to be very, very interesting. Now, like I said, some of the data that is here is kind of weird. Fritz combined different kinds of 22 calibers, and he also combined different platforms shooting the 22 calibers, whether they be rifles or handguns. With 357, he combined both 357 Magnum and 357 SIG, which are not really the same round, don't really have the same shooting characteristics, or even the same muzzle energy. And then there's some of his data sets, like the 32 ACP and the 44 Magnum, that were really small data sets. There were less than 30 encounters altogether in his data set. And so, in addition to looking at the data as a whole, I also decided to go ahead and eliminate some of the data sets that might be problematic. In the first elimination, I took out the ones that were in red, the 32 ACP and the 44 Magnum. Those sample sizes were just too small to really give you good solid data. And so I took those out. I still left in the ones that were the combined data sets because those ones are at least fairly large. That is one advantage of combining data sets, is that you get a bigger overall data set and you can still get good stats off of it, to a certain extent at least. And so I recrunched everything, taking out the 44 Magnum and the 32 from the list, and of course that changes what your point of comparison is. If 44 Magnum isn't on the list anymore, then your highest muzzle energy is going to go to the 357, and so I adjusted that. 9mm was still on the list, so the rounds count, the highest rounds count was still the same. And then a 44 Magnum is not on the list. The highest accuracy rating is not going to be 0.88. It's going to be 0.85 with the 45 ACP, that is. And then, of course, the best incapacitation rate remains 0.91 because the 357 I'm still leaving in it for this next data set. So it's the standard there. Redo everything with the same thing, using coefficients, and this time I'm not going to go through and reformulate these numbers. I've already showed you how you get the numbers for it. But you have the predicted values over here, the actual values, and of course all these values are now standardized values, but actual standardized incapacitation rate versus the predicted incapacitation rate based on combining these standardized values according to these coefficients. And then what we're trying to do is minimize the median error of all of this. And without the 32 ACP and the 44 Magnum, the median margin of error actually does shrink a bit. It used to be 0.06974. Now it's 0.05190. So taking out those data points actually gave us better explanatory power. And also the coefficients that wound up optimizing this drastically shifted. It used to be very little emphasis on muzzle energy and about equal on rounds and accuracy. When we took out the 44 Magnum and the 32 ACP, which are very small data sets, it turns out that muzzle energy was basically a non-contributor, at least at the point that we're going here. We're just doing two significant figures. It might be at a smaller level, but as far as two significant figures are concerned, it's basically a non-influencer. And then rounds count was still an influence, but not nearly as much as it used to be. It used to be 46% contributor. Now it's only a 26% contributor. And then the accuracy, the importance of accuracy went way up. It used to be 50%, now it's 74%. And so that is interesting. And this is, out of all the ones I did other adjustments later on, out of all of them, this is the one that has the best explanatory power. It has the smallest margin of error. But I didn't want to just stop there. I wanted to make sure that I analyzed all the other possible combinations. So I did it with taking out the small data sets. And then the next one, that's where I got the median margin of error 0.05190. And then for the next one, I took out the mixed data sets and left in the small data sets. Went through and did the same process with them, and I got that the muzzle energy was basically a non-contributor, at least at the resolution that we're looking at within 2 sig figs. And then round count and accuracy were basically 6 in one, half and dozen, and the other split for predictive power, which I found really interesting. But when I left in those small, those numbers that come from the small data sets, the 32 ACP and the 44 Magnum, like I said, Ella Fritz's original study included less than 30 encounters with both of those rounds. When I left those in, the error margin, the median error margin, actually grew quite a bit. So it was 0.06974. I got it down to 0.0519 by taking the red ones out, the 32 ACP and the 45 Magnum. I left them in and took out the blue ones instead, and the error margin grew to 0.08381. That's definitely going in the wrong direction. So this is an interesting analysis, but given that the error margin is so much larger, I wouldn't put a lot of stock in it over just the data as a whole, or taking out those small data sets. And then finally, I decided to take out all of the data that could be problematic. So the small data sets and also the mixed data sets, took it all out, and I got values that were relatively close to the data sets as a whole, with a little bit of a change. The muzzle energy actually did wind up becoming more of a contributing factor when I eliminated all of the problematic data sets. It's now about 9% of the total, which is more than it's showed up in any of the other ones. And then the round count and the accuracy were pretty evenly split, but what is interesting is that round count actually became more important, a better predictor than accuracy was, which I found to be interesting. Not by much, we're just talking 1 percentage point out of the combined whole, but still just a little bit better. And the error margin for this one, 0.06750, is just a little bit better than the data as a whole. So that one is going in the right direction. And then summarizing it, this is what we have. So all data, if I want to know what contributes the most to handgun effectiveness, I'm looking at all data. Muzzle energy is only 4%. The rounds per encounter is 46% of what contributes to the overall effectiveness, just being incapacitation. Will the handgun incapacitate the person or not? And then accuracy being the more major one. Without the small sets, which I feel is the best one because this is the margin of error, by the way. I should have labeled that, but I didn't. I apologize. But this is the margin of error for each one. The one that I got the best margin of error, which means the best explanatory power, was without the small sets, and it gave a very clear delineation as to what contributed to handgun effectiveness the most, and that was definitely accuracy. Followed to a lesser extent, and a significantly lesser extent, by round count, and then muzzle energy was basically a non-contributor. Took out the mixed sets, muzzle energy again was a non-contributor, and then predictive ability was basically split between round count and accuracy. And then finally, when I took out all the problematic data, I get something that was pretty similar to the first one, a little bit better explanatory power. But again, muzzle energy, not that big of a contributor. And then I got a reversal in which one was more important versus rounds encounter versus accuracy. It wasn't by much, but it was a little bit of a reversal. All right, and so taken as a whole, what does this tell us about handgun effectiveness? Is it true that a larger caliber, when we're talking about humans, of course, and when you're talking about animals, it's a little bit different story. When you're talking about, possibly being attacked by a cougar or a bear or something like that, or an angry mother moose or something like that, penetration is going to be a bigger issue, and so you're going to want a more powerful round for that. But frankly, human beings, at least most human beings, aren't, going to be comparable with a moose, and so you don't need as much penetration. And so, the kinetic energy, really, the muzzle energy just isn't that big of an issue when you're talking about human targets. And so as an average, if you're taking all of the different analyses together, maybe 3% of what makes your handgun effective is muzzle energy. It's a consideration, but it's not a major one. The more major considerations is going to be your confidence in putting multiple rounds downrange. If you have a very small magazine or just a limited number of rounds in the gun, like in a revolver, that can be a disadvantage. Now, the revolvers wound up actually doing pretty good in overall wound up doing pretty good in overall incapacitation rate, but it's still something that's going to play in your mind. If you know that you only have 5 or 6 shots, or with a 45, 7 or 8 shots, it's definitely going to make you a little bit reticent to fire off that next round. And that could be the difference between stopping the threat or not. And then I would say, especially based on the data set that gave me the best explanatory power, that had the best or the most minimized margin of error, I would say that your accuracy is going to be the best indicator as to whether or not your handgun actually stops a threat or not. If you cannot hit accurately with your handgun, regardless of how big it is, it doesn't do you any good. Okay, you could have, a 500 Smith & Wesson revolver, but if you can't hit the broadside of a barn with it, you're not any threat to the bad guy. That's just a simple fact. And I've done all the mathematical analysis on it to say what should be a really obvious fact. Whether or not you can actually hit your target with your gun is going to be much more of an issue than how powerful the round itself is. The power of the round only makes any kind of a difference if you can actually get a hit, and you can get a hit in a good place. So accuracy over muzzle energy is statistically, from what we see here with the Greg Elfrid study, and granted that's just one study, but from what we're seeing here, accuracy and also rounds count are definitely going to outweigh muzzle energy. So let's say you're someone who's like me, I'm a little bit recoil sensitive, especially when it comes to handguns. Rifles not so much, but especially with handguns, definitely recoil sensitive. Definitely suffer from shot anticipation, those kinds of things. And frankly, some of the more powerful handguns are really hard for me to shoot accurately just because of shot anticipation issues. For example, 45, yeah, I can shoot it, and I can be reasonably accurate with a 45, but it is a really unwieldy gun for me. It really is. I do not like it. I cannot shoot it as accurately as, say, I can a 9mm or something smaller. And so for me, given that I'm more accurate with those smaller calibers, that for me actually is the better thing. As far as incapacitation for, a human-sized threat, the caliber really doesn't matter that much. And as we saw up here, yes, the lower calibers do have incapacitation rates that are lower. That is certainly true. But mathematically, that is because of the combination of the number of rounds per encounter and the accuracy in each encounter, more so than the muzzle energy. So what that means is that even if you have a relatively small handgun shooting not necessarily small handgun, but a small caliber handgun, if you can shoot accurately with it, and if you have enough rounds in it to make you confident to keep shooting more rounds, then you're very likely to have a very good incapacitation rate, even if the gun is one of these mouse calibers. Okay, what we need to be looking for in our handguns is a good rounds count and good accuracy, more so than muzzle energy. Okay, you could have a howitzer with you if you wanted to, but if you can't hit your target with it, all the power that the howitzer has is not going to do you any good. Same thing with a rocket launcher or a grenade launcher. If you don't actually hit the target within the effective range of the round, it's not going to do anything to the target. Okay, a grenade has a pretty good size effective range, but if I don't actually manage to get the grenade within the target, close enough to the target for that effective range to mean something, it's not going to do anything. And of course that applies on a much smaller scale with handguns. Okay, all of this data, however you look at it, the one thing that they're all consistent in showing is that muzzle energy, it may be a contributor, but it is not, when it comes to handguns that is, it is not the most determinative contributor. It is worth taking a look at. If you have two handguns that have basically the same round counts and you're just as accurate with either one, then yeah, go with the one that has the greater muzzle energy. But if you're like me and the ones that have greater muzzle energy are harder for you to get accurate shots off with, or the round itself is so big that can't fit a whole lot of rounds in the magazine and therefore are not going to be as likely to keep firing, well, then you have to take that into consideration. A small caliber gun that holds a lot of rounds and you can fire accurately is statistically, according to this data, going to serve you better than a large caliber that doesn't hold too many rounds and you cannot fire as effectively, which makes sense. This data here isn't really telling us anything that common sense doesn't already tell us, and a whole lot of other studies have already told us. This just puts it in a little bit more precise, exhaustive form. And the general trend here, I would say, is a pretty good way to look at it. So if you're looking for a handgun, and yeah, there's lots of other things that you need to consider rather than just muzzle energy, round counts, and accuracy. There's lots of other things like how comfortable it is to wear on you if you're going to use it for self-defense and those kinds of things. How are the operating controls? How safe is the gun when you have it holstered? Those kinds of things. There are lots of other things to consider. But out of these three things, muzzle energy, the round count, and accuracy, I would agree with the general trend of all the analyses. The accuracy is going to be your foremost analysis. Find a gun that you can shoot accurately. And then find a gun that within that category of guns that you can carry comfortably, and so that you can carry them regularly and those kinds of things, and that are relatively safe to carry, that are safe when holstered the proper way, etc., etc. Then look for one that has a pretty good round count. Enough rounds in it that you would be confident in continuing to fire until the threat is stopped. You're not going to be thinking about, how close am I to running out? If you're thinking about how close you are to running out rather than just simply dealing with the threat in front of you, it might be a good sign that your magazine capacity is maybe a little too small. And then after you've got those two nailed down, then you can consider the caliber. Now, one thing that I did notice in the data is that there is one particular caliber that kept exceeding its predicted value by a good amount, and that was the 380. Also, the 357 would often exceed its predicted value as well, but not always. Sometimes it was the 38 special, depending on which one you look, if the 357 wasn't in the running. But one that was consistent across pretty much all of the analyses, no matter which data you were looking at, the 380 was a consistent overperformer. It pretty much always did better than you would expect it to based on these three factors: muzzle energy, round count, and accuracy. 380 pretty much always was more effective than you would think that it would be. And I think that is worth looking into for a lot of people. 380 is a relatively low pressure round, and because of that, it doesn't have a whole lot of kick. It's a lot easier to shoot and shoot accurately. And the round count on it isn't anything amazing. There's a lot of 380s out there that are 6, 7, or 8 shot magazines, which isn't a ton, But if you carry a spare magazine with you and you just plan on dumping the first mag into the threat, and then after you've done a mag dump, then load in the new magazine if that's what your plan is, and you can carry that extra magazine. And an extra 380 magazine is not much to carry at all. A 380 magazine is relatively small, especially if it's one of the single stacked ones. It can fit into pretty much any pocket with a great amount of ease. It doesn't take a whole lot to do that. And so relatively low pressure round, easy to shoot. With a spare mag, you have a good round count. And statistically, it exceeds its numerical expectations consistently, no matter how you look at the data set, what data points you include in the data set that you would want to look at or not. It always does okay. And I think that is definitely worth looking at. So if you're like me and you're recoil sensitive and you can't shoot the big guns too well, 380 is not a bad option. It is an expensive round, I'll say that. That's another consideration that you have to do, is that if you're going to get accurate with a gun, you're going to have to practice with it at least sometime. And you're going to have to shoot it, and it's going to cost money to shoot it. And so 380 is an expensive round. You'll have to take that into consideration. But if you're one of those people that is not likely to practice with your gun very often, and because of that the cost of practice ammunition isn't going to be that big of an issue for you, but you want something that's going to be relatively effective when you need it, 380 is not a bad way to go. Not a bad way at all. Like I said, it definitely exceeds the predicted values, and then the final incapacitation rate for 380 isn't bad compared to a lot of other guns. It's definitely comparable with a lot of the other higher calibers, and even beats the 38 Special, which is kind of cool. Alright, so that has been my rather long and tortured analysis of basically what should be a fairly obvious fact. When it comes to these three contributing factors right here, muzzle energy, the round count, rounds per encounter, and accuracy, all that this data shows us is that muzzle energy really isn't what determines whether or not your handgun is going to be effective. It is much more so the case that the round count and the accuracy are going to contribute to successful defense of yourself or others rather than muzzle energy. Okay, now am I saying that, go ahead and go out and buy a 22, 25, or a 32 because caliber doesn't matter? Well, yes and no. The muzzle energy itself doesn't seem to be the contributing factor, but the round count and the accuracy are, and handguns that are made for 22, 25, and 32 tend to be rather unwieldy things. A 25 caliber handgun is a very small handgun, and the same thing with 32s, is that they are very small handguns, and they are very difficult to shoot accurately. Not because they have a lot of recoil, they don't. It's relatively small muzzle energy. But the guns themselves are just so small, it's hard to get a good proper grip on them, and then the sights are usually terrible, etc., etc. There's a laundry list of problems with them. But hypothetically, at least, if you could find a handgun that was chambered in one of these that was big enough for you to get a good grip on, but still small enough for you to easily carry it and regularly carry it, you get a good grip on it, get accurate shots off, practice fairly often with it to get to the point where you're fairly accurate with it, and then, have enough rounds with you, either in the gun itself or in a spare magazine, that you weren't super worried about sending rounds downrange, then yeah, a 22, 25, or a 32 could work for you. But it's just going to depend on how that particular model of gun is. If it's one of the typical ones that's really small and hard to work, probably not. But if you can find one that's a little bit bigger, good round counts, and you take it to the range and you actually are more accurate with it than you would be with something else, then by all means, then you'll probably be just fine. Now, there are still issues with, say, 22, for example. 22 is rimfire, of course, and rimfire ignition systems aren't the most reliable in the world. I have multiple rimfire guns and I absolutely love them, but there is a failure rate that is associated with rimfire rounds. Sometimes it's because of duds, and sometimes it's just because of how they work in particular guns. If you put a rimfire cartridge into a semi-auto, for example, you're going to wind up with some issues. And for me, what I would consider to be an acceptable failure rate and a fairly common failure rate across my different rimfire platforms is about 1 in 100. I would say that that's probably acceptable for self-defense, but certainly not optimal. And if you have a rimfire gun that falls below that in reliability, you get a malfunction more than 1 time in 100, then you probably don't want to use that for self-defense. Just saying, and that's something to be aware of. Okay. And then also another problem that you get with the smaller calibers, while we're talking about it, might as well talk about it, is that the smaller calibers like 25 and 32 and even 380, those 3 rounds right there are fairly expensive. 22 isn't very expensive, but can be a little bit unreliable. 25, 32, and 380 are typically more reliable, but they're also more expensive, which means you're not as likely to practice with them. And especially in the case of 25 and 32 caliber pistols, if you're not practicing with them, your accuracy really could suffer, and that can be a problem. But anyways, the biggest issue to look at, of course, is always going to be accuracy, I would say, especially with the data set here that I got the best margin of error on, the smallest margin of error. Look at accuracy first, then look at the round count, and then last but perhaps not least, there overall it seems that it was at least a factor in some of the analyses. Then finally look at muzzle energy. But yeah, how accurately you can shoot the gun is far more important than the muzzle energy. And accuracy in combination with a good round count is definitely going to be on your side. What makes a handgun effective? Primarily accuracy, then your round count, and then last, but perhaps not completely negligible, muzzle energy. But it is definitely the last consideration. Now, does that mean that people who fire bigger handguns like the 350, who carry bigger calibers for self-defense are necessarily doing it wrong? Not necessarily. Somebody carries around a 357 and likes it and they're accurate with it, and fine. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. And if you want to carry around 45 and you feel that you're sufficiently accurate with it and you think that you have enough of a round count that you can confidently, go through your entire magazine if you have to, because you happen to have a spare mag or something like that. If that's what you want to do, and that's the round that you're comfortable with and it works for you, great. But what I'm saying is that the caliber size in and of itself isn't what is most determinative of these 3 factors. Accuracy followed by round count is what's going to do it. And especially in this particular data set right here, that bears that out. Accuracy far and away is the best indicator of whether or not you're going to be successful. Okay, find a gun you can shoot accurately. Okay. All right, I beat that horse to death. Fun video. I absolutely loved it. I don't know if you guys loved it, but I loved it. See you guys. Bye.